of all, I'd like to give a warm thank you to the organizers for inviting us to this faraway country to this conference. My talk today is on the use of chemotherapy post-surgery and deciding on which patient to give chemotherapy to, and the kind of regimens we choose for our patients are issues that we grapple with every day in our clinical practice for those who do breast cancer sessions. Why do we even give chemotherapy post-surgery? We give chemotherapy post-surgery because it has been shown definitively in landmark studies that this has a significant impact on recurrence as well as survival in patients post-surgery. And this is evidenced by the landmark studies such as the Milan study and the intergroup 0011 study, as well as it was confirmed by the Oxford Overview meta-analysis. The Milan study was a study of predominantly lymph node positive patients, and they were randomized to receive either chemotherapy in an older regimen, cyclophosphamide, methotrexate, and 5-fluorouracil. And this was given for 12 cycles versus patients who were not given chemotherapy at all. And what they found was there was a significant risk reduction in recurrence as well as an improvement in survival. This was further confirmed by the intergroup study of predominantly node-negative patients this time, and these were high-risk node-negative patients who were randomized to chemotherapy versus observation. And once again, we see a significant impact on disease-free survival. The meta-analysis confirmed these findings, and they showed that patients were given chemotherapy with either the older CMF regimen or with this time anthracycline-based regimens, and they found that there was a significant difference once again in recurrence as well as survival. This benefit is irregardless of what age the patient was, the lymph node status, the estrogen receptor status, as well as tumor differentiation, tumor size, and whether or not tamoxifen was used. So who should we actually offer adjuvant chemotherapy to? There are several guideline bodies that have offered guidelines for these to help us in our selection. One of this was the St. criteria. The second was NCCN, as well as there are some computer programs such as Adjuvant Online that can actually assist us in our decision making. There are also decisions that we can form based on the molecular characteristics of the patient in our present age of genomic testing. The clinical pathological features are things like lymph node status, tumor size, histological grade, hormone receptor status, HER2 status, lymphovascular invasion, as well as the age of the patient. The St. criteria actually recommends chemotherapy for all HER2 positive patients, as well as triple negative patients, and for estrogen receptor positive patients with variability according to their risk. They do recommend that for patients with the following risk characteristics that chemotherapy is offered, and these include lowered hormone receptor levels, grade 3, high proliferation index, which in this case refers to either a high Ki-67 level or increased frequency of mitosis seen on pathology, but we do do not routinely use Ki-67 to guide our treatment decisions. Others such as lymph node status, peritumoral vascular invasion, the tumor size, patient preference, and if all this is not enough, then you can consider using molecular testing using gene expression profiling if cost permits, although these are very expensive tests. With the current era of genomic expression studies, breast cancers are now divided into various subtypes, and there are 4 main subtypes: luminal A, B, the HER2 positive subtype, as well as basal-like subtypes. And the luminal A and B are the ones with the best prognosis, and the HER2 positive and basal-like subtypes have a poorer prognosis, both in terms of recurrence as well as survival. These are the descriptions of what the breast cancer subtypes are, and you can see that it has gradually found its way into our practice because these are the most recent Singalan guideline criteria, and even they have actually used these conventional subtype differentiations to actually form chemotherapy recommendations. So for luminal A subtype, which has the best prognosis, they actually recommend that endocrine therapy alone would be appropriate. However, there are certain criteria that would make one decide to give chemotherapy in luminal A subtype patients, and these would be things like either a high proliferative index, a high recurrence score, or whether there is grade 3 disease or involvement of multiple lymph nodes. For luminal B, several subtypes several patients perhaps would necessitate chemotherapy, and in general, for triple negative and HER2 positive patients, they would recommend chemotherapy. Now moving on to the NCCN guidelines. The NCCN guidelines actually recommend that if you are node positive, if the patient is node positive, then you would offer as a category 1 recommendation chemotherapy as well as endocrine therapy. However, for tumors that are more than 0.5 cm, you would offer adjuvant endocrine therapy and plus or minus adjuvant chemotherapy based on their risk factors. And for tumors that are very small, node negative, less than 0.5 cm, you could consider just adjuvant endocrine therapy alone. Now, for triple negative breast cancers, the tumor sizes cut off are slightly different. So for anything 0.6 centimeters or more, then you could consider adjuvant chemotherapy. But for those who are 0.5 cm or less, normally no adjuvant chemotherapy unless there is local involvement, even in a micrometastatic disease. So what about adjuvant online, which is the computer program? It was introduced in the early 2000s, and this is a computer program that we use very often in our clinics when we see patients because it actually helps to give a graphical representation of your recurrence as well as mortality. And it's easy to see because it's in a colorful bar chart. So this adjuvant online is actually based on evidence which is from the SECCIYA database, as well as some overviews of the Oxford overviews, as well as individual clinical trials. And there are several patient characteristics, most importantly of which the patient cannot have been exposed to neoadjuvant chemotherapy before, and it has to be non-metastatic. So this is what adjuvant online is, and I'm not sure if it's used here as well. But basically, this gives you a description of the benefits with regards to hormone chemotherapy and combined treatment. It also gives you a proportional risk reduction description, and also it gives you the chance to die from other causes, so it's a very good tool to use for the patient. So these are the advantages as described. And of course the limitations are, this program doesn't incorporate any HER2 testing. It is based mainly on Caucasian population, whereas our patients are all from Asia. And it has a wide-ranging tumor as well as lymph node categorization. And it doesn't take into account high-risk features such as other risk factors such as favorable histology and lymphovascular invasion. So how does it driven online actually compare in our Asian population? So this is a study actually done by which involves some members of our institution, and it actually analyzed it driven online in the Asian population. And they found that this computer program consistently overestimated the prognosis of Asian patients compared to Western population. And why is this so? I think it's because we may have different life expectancies, difference in tumor biology, in that HER2 expression is more common in Asians. There are a higher proportion of younger women with more unfavorable characteristics. The effects of anti-cancer therapy are different, treatment compliances are different, and there are also differences in lifestyle. So there are new tools in the genomic era, such as Oncotype DX and MemberPrint, and in our practice we use Oncotype DX more commonly. So Oncotype DX is actually a 21-gene recurrence score, and it includes 16 cancer-related genes and 15 5 reference genes. It was validated for stage 1 as well as stage 2 hormone receptor positive lymph node negative patients. And it has been validated to be prognostic for tamoxifen-treated patients, in that those with a higher recurrence score would have a higher risk of recurrence, and those with a lower recurrence score would have a lower risk of recurrence, significantly different. And it has also been shown that if you give chemotherapy actually has a 28% absolute benefit for those patients who fall within the high recurrence score category, whereas those in the lower recurrence score would derive little if any benefit from chemo. Now, the Oncotype DX score has also been extended to lymph node positive patients, and these were investigated in the SWOG study. And once again, they used tumor blocks from lymph node positive patients who were treated with either tamoxifen or tamoxifen versus CAF chemotherapy. And they found that tamoxifen-treated patients actually had worse overall survival and disease-free survival for those who had a high recurrence score. And once again, like the previous NSABP study, they found that giving chemotherapy was the most beneficial in those with a high recurrence score. So there are ongoing studies, such as the TAILOR-X study, that's actually looking at the intermediate group patients to see whether or not chemotherapy would be beneficial in them, as well as the responder trial, which is looking specifically at lymph node positive patients to see whether or not those with the lower recurrence score would also derive a similar benefit from chemotherapy. Now, the MemberPrint study is something that we do not usually use in our clinical practice. So in our institution, we use the Oncotype DX score. The difference between Oncotype DX and MemberPrint is that MemberPrint can use either fresh frozen or formalin-fixed paraffin embedded tissues now, and it actually has a wider inclusion, stage 1, 2, lymph node positive or negative, ER positive, negative, and HER2 positive or negative. And it's only prognostic and has a dichotomous prediction. So there are now some clinical scenarios that I'm going to run through. And the first scenario is a small node negative breast cancer patient, less than 1 cm, is this high enough risk to actually warrant systemic net-driven therapy? So if you have a 35-year-old lady, 0.9 centimeters, node negative, grade 3 IDC, ER negative, PR 5%, HER2 FISH positive, would you then offer chemotherapy for her and HER2 therapy? So looking at this in relation to what I've just discussed, for the NCCN guidelines, the updated version actually says that 0.6 to 1 cm you would consider, and more than 1 cm would be recommended to use trastuzumab. The Singalan guidelines actually recommend that you always give chemotherapy with trastuzumab, and in the adjuvant setting, you wouldn't use trastuzumab alone. The adjuvant online says the benefit from chemotherapy in this patient is 7% without relapse and 2% for survival. HER2 status is not accounted for in the adjuvant online. So probably in that patient, you would recommend chemotherapy and trastuzumab. Now, we move on to the second case. When is a node-positive breast cancer 1 to 3 lymph nodes of low enough risk to warrant no adjuvant chemotherapy? So if you have a 65-year-old female, 0.9 centimeters node-positive 1 lymph node, grade 1, IDC, ER/PR positive, HER2 negative, would you then offer her chemotherapy alone, or and endocrine therapy, or would you just offer endocrine therapy alone? So looking at the guidelines again, the NCCN says we should offer this patient chemotherapy and endocrine therapy. The Singalan guideline says because of the grade 1, small tumor size, elderly, we should favor endocrine therapy alone. But Adjuvant Online says the benefit from chemotherapy is 2.6% for relapse and 0.7% for survival. So where are we in this situation? There are several tests you could order, mammogram possibly, but we don't have it in Singapore. Oncotype DX is not recommended in this situation because it's not positive yet, although we do have small amount of data from the SWOT study. So in this case, you would probably offer chemotherapy, but with discussion to the patient about the risk and benefit. So how does application of multi-gene signatures in practice work? If you now have a 35-year-old patient, 1.6 centimeters, node negative, grade 1 IDC, ER/PR positive, HER2 negative. Your treatment options in this patient are tamoxifen alone, tamoxifen plus Zoladex, or tamoxifen plus chemotherapy. But because she's young, and suppose she's very keen on chemotherapy, if you look at Adjuvant Online, the absolute survival gain from chemo is 3%. The Oncotype DX that you do gives you a recurrence score of 22, which is of intermediate risk. They calculate that the average risk of recurrence is 14% at 10 years, and the absolute gain from chemotherapy is actually negative 1.8%. So in this case, if you use Oncotype DX, perhaps it is not very informative in this situation. Now, if you have an alternative scenario, a 60-year-old lady, 1.5 cm, grade 3, IDC, ER/PR positive, HER2 negative, your adjuvant options are endocrine therapy alone, or endocrine plus chemotherapy, but suppose she's not very keen for chemo because perhaps she's elderly. Looking at Adjuvant Online, it gives you a once again identical absolute risk or absolute gain from chemo of 3%. So you do an Oncotype DX for her. And this time, the recurrence score is actually 46. So you actually derive an absolute gain from chemotherapy of 27%. And in this case, this information actually could change your management. So these multi-gene signatures are selectively beneficial in different scenarios. So adjuvant chemotherapy decision-making depends on many factors such as clinical pathological factors, clinical judgment. Sometimes we routinely use adjuvant online to show the patients as well as multi-gene predictors in selected cases if cost permitted. So what adjuvant chemotherapies do we use in our institution? Now looking at the data from before, the older trials actually compared anthracyclines to CMF chemotherapy, which is the older regimen, and they found that actually both red types are equivalent, or anthracyclines are slightly better than the older regimen of CMF. And this is confirmed by the meta-analysis. Now looking at the addition of taxanes to anthracyclines, various trials have examined addition of taxanes in either a sequential or concurrent method, and they have most of the trials have found a significant disease-free as well as overall survival benefit when you add taxanes to anthracyclines. And this once again is confirmed by the Oxford Overview meta-analysis. Now, we now know that anthracyclines and taxanes are probably one of the most effective regimens around, and the schedule of delivery has been investigated either in dose lengths, weekly or 2-weekly fashion, or sequentially versus concurrently. And in summary, they have found that giving it in a weekly or dose lengths 2-weekly regimen is actually favored over the 3-weekly regimen in general for paclitaxel, and for docetaxel, AC times 4 followed by 3-weekly docetaxel is also good. Now for sequential and concurrent, there is one trial, the NSABP, which actually favors the sequential regimen, and 2 others which found no significant difference. What about taxanes replacing anthracyclines? We have only one positive trial so far, which is TC versus AC, the US Oncology Group study for stage 1 to 3 breast cancers, and they have found that there was actually a significant disease-free as well as overall survival for the TC regimen over AC. However, at this current time, there's insufficient prospective data to recommend using completely non-anthracycline regimens over just taxanes alone, as data is only limited to that study. So, in our institution, normally if we give anthracyclines and taxanes, we normally give either AC times 4 followed by weekly paclitaxel, or AC times 4 followed by 3-weekly docetaxel for 4 cycles as well. And there are other regimens which can be used, such as FEC every 3 weeks for 3 cycles, followed by docetaxel every 3 weeks for 3 cycles. And we use just anthracycline regimens alone. We use either AC times 4 every 3 weeks or FAC times 6 every 3 weeks. So in summary, just to conceptualize all that has been discussed, but this is by no means definitive. If you have a node-positive patient, you will offer adjuvant chemotherapy. If it's node-negative, tumor size small, no chemotherapy, small less than 0.5 cm. And if it's more than 0.5 cm, you should take into account other risk factors such as tumor size, grade, lymphovascular invasion, ER status, and then decide on whether or not to give chemotherapy to this patient. So the important take-home message is that select your patients wisely, and if you give adjuvant chemotherapy, we give it in a combination of drugs and not single agents, unless you're using the taxanes, paclitaxel, docetaxel. Okay. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about updates on adjuvant and chronic therapy in breast cancer. And firstly, if we use the NCCN 2014 guidelines as a reference, recommendations are divided into those for postmenopausal women and those for premenopausal women. And for postmenopausal women, the current recommendation is to incorporate an aromatase inhibitor at least during the course of the therapy, and that's a category 1 recommendation. And tamoxifen for 5 years without an aromatase inhibitor should only be considered if there are contraindications to using an AI, patient declines, or there is unacceptable toxicity to an AI. As for premenopausal women, the recommendation is 5 years of tamoxifen, also a category 1 recommendation, but there is also a category 2B recommendation here for plus or minus ovarian function suppression population. That means there is no uniform consensus and it's low level of evidence. After the patient completes 5 years of tamoxifen, then if the patient remains premenopausal, options include no further therapy or extending tamoxifen to beyond 5 years to extend to 10 years. Or if the patient has become postmenopausal, then options include either extending tamoxifen to 10 years or to switch to an aromatase inhibitor for another 5 years, both of which are category 1 recommendation. And comparing with previous guidelines, what is new since 2012 is the consideration of extending tamoxifen beyond 5 years, which is based on data from the ALTO and the ETON trial. Now, firstly, on postmenopausal women, there is actually very little controversy in this category. And essentially, we want to use an aromatase inhibitor as the backbone. And there are multiple randomized trials that have been performed using an aromatase inhibitor, comparing against the reference regimen of 5 years of tamoxifen. We are all very familiar with the upfront studies, so 5 years of an AI versus 5 years of tamoxifen. The sequential studies of 2 to 3 years of tamoxifen, followed by 2 to 3 years of AI or the reverse switch. And then the extended AI approach of 5 years of tamoxifen, followed by 5 years of AI. And to summarize, there are at least 10 published trials evaluating an AI versus tamoxifen, either upfront, sequential, or using the extended approach. And many had at least 5 years follow-up, with the longest one having 120 months of follow-up. That's an ATAC trial. Almost all showed a disease-free survival benefit, and even those studies that did not had the correct trend. The hazard ratio is in the range of 0.5 to 0.8, and the absolute gain is in the range of about 3 to 4% at 5 years. And generally, the studies did not report overall survival benefit in the intention to treat cohort, but there are some exceptions as listed here. And there are a number of still relatively unanswered issues. And firstly, between the different strategies, is there a better one? How does upfront compare with sequential approach? And there are at least 2 studies to evaluate this. So we have this question being one of the questions that is addressed in the Big 198 study. And there is also the TEAM trial that compares 5 years of exemestane versus the sequential tamoxifen, followed by exemestane, and there are no differences so far. The next million-dollar question is one of the 3 third-generation AIs better than the other? And there are several studies to evaluate this. So we have the MA27 trial comparing anastrozole versus exemestane, as well as the PHASE trial comparing anastrozole versus letrozole, and essentially no differences have been reported so far. So essentially, in practice, the 3 third-generation AIs can be used interchangeably in the adjuvant setting. Now, when we're prescribing an AI, essentially giving this for at least 2 to 3 years or even 5 years, we need to be aware that one of the most common complications that we will encounter is AI-induced bone loss. And this is clearly demonstrated in the ABCSG study. And in those patients who are given Zoladex plus an AI, over a 5-year period, there is an 8 to 14% drop in bone mineral density if we were not given Zoladex. And therefore, when we were to start a patient on an AI, practical considerations is to make sure that we have a baseline bone mineral density scan, ensure that the patient has sufficient calcium and vitamin D supplements, encourage the patient to perform weight-bearing exercises, monitor the bone mineral density scan once every 1 to 2 years, and also assess fracture risk. So what are some of the fracture risk factors? These include score of less than -1.5, older patient, very thin patient, people who have a family history of fragility fractures or have personal history of fragility fractures before age 50, chronic use of steroids or smoking. And if indeed the patient has a low baseline T-score of -2.0 or there are at least 2 fracture risk factors, you might want to consider initiating bone-directed therapy. And the most commonly used would be a bisphosphonate such as zoledronate. And as you can see from the ABCSG study, where patients were randomized to receive or not to receive zoledronate, compared to patients who did not receive zoledronate, there is clear preservation of bone mineral density, suggesting that this is one way to overcome this problem. And of course, we may also be aware that apart from the bisphosphonates, there is another class of agents, the Branco inhibitors, which is denosumab, that has also been FDA approved for exactly the same indication. There are some unanswered questions, and one key question is the duration of AI. And you can see from the number of studies that are still ongoing, that for which data we are still awaiting, we really illustrate the point that this is unanswered. So there are many studies that are ongoing to try to figure out, is longer duration even better? Then there is this other question of scheduling, and this is being addressed by this interesting study by the big group, Big 107. And the idea here is to explore if intermittent scheduling of letrozole, given 9 months on, 3 months off every year for 5 years, could be better than continuous letrozole administration for 5 years. And the whole rationale here is that the patient's own estrogen in the intermittent arm could potentially trigger apoptosis and reduce recurrence rates in this estrogen-deprived state. And it will be interesting to await the data to see if this could be a new way to administer an AI. Now, moving on to premenopausal women, as opposed to postmenopausal women, there are a lot more debatable issues, and some of the more controversial issues include: what is the role of ovarian function suppression or ablation? What is the role of an AI together with ovarian suppression? And what is the role of extended adjuvant endocrine therapy beyond 5 years? And I'd just like to illustrate some of the key issues with a scenario. So this is a 41-year-old premenopausal female who was diagnosed with a 2.1 centimeter node-negative tumor, grade 2 invasive ductal carcinoma. She has completed breast cancer surgery. The tumor is quite strongly positive for hormone receptors, negative for COL2. You offered her chemotherapy, but she declined. So what adjuvant endocrine therapy would you offer? Would you offer tamoxifen for 5 years, ovarian function suppression plus tamoxifen, or ovarian function suppression plus an aromatase inhibitor? Now, in this patient, we had originally intended to give chemotherapy. So the question is, could we give ovarian function suppression as an alternative to chemotherapy? And indeed, there are several randomized trials that have compared ovarian function suppression with older generation chemotherapy regimens, predominantly the CMF-like regimen or anthracyclines-containing regimen, but none that contain taxanes or any of the newer generation regimens. But certainly when compared with the older generation regimens, they appear to be equivalent. And indeed, there are some guidelines that endorse the use of ovarian function suppression as an alternative to adjuvant chemotherapy, although the caveat here is that only if the patient declines chemotherapy. So let's say you decided to give adjuvant ovarian function suppression. Then the next question is, how about combining this with an aromatase inhibitor rather than with tamoxifen, since an aromatase inhibitor has been shown to be better in postmenopausal women? And this question is addressed by the ABCSG 12 study, which enrolled 1,800 women, randomizing them to goserelin plus tamoxifen or goserelin plus anastrozole with or without zoledronate. And at 62 months follow-up, this is the comparison between tamoxifen and anastrozole. There is no difference in disease-free survival between the 2 treatment arms, but overall survival was actually worse with anastrozole, with a hazard ratio of 1.75. At this point, the number of events are actually small. It is unclear what is the reason for the difference, but for now, the interpretation of this set of data is that ovarian function suppression plus an AI is not better than ovarian function suppression plus tamoxifen in premenopausal women and should not be routinely given. In fact, there is a possibility that it could be worse. To resolve this issue, there are 2 other ongoing randomized trials evaluating exactly the same question. That's addressed by the soft trial and the text trial. And when we have data from these two studies, that will provide further insights on whether this could be something that might be beneficial. Currently, based on these data, since 2013, when the St. Garden consensus panel met, this is what the panel felt. A large majority of the panel felt that ovarian function suppression plus an AR should not be standard therapy for premenopausal women, although a similarly high proportion agrees that this could be a valid option if tamoxifen is contraindicated. I'd like to highlight the fact that contraindications are often relative, and the thresholds to interpret a contraindication may vary between different physicians. So just to illustrate an example, the German AGO guidelines would actually recommend tamoxifen plus adequate anticoagulation in patients with a deep vein thrombosis and not ovarian function suppression plus an AI. Now, if you have decided to give ovarian function suppression plus an AI because tamoxifen is contraindicated, then how long should we give this? According to the ABCSG study, probably at least 3 years, although you may want to consider giving this for 5 years since we routinely give tamoxifen for 5 years. And we want to ensure the patient's ovarian function is suppressed during this period before starting the therapy, and that, in practical terms, means that you start the LHRH agonist first and wait at least 4 to 8 weeks, because studies have shown that by 4 weeks, 60 to 70% of the patients would have ceased menstruation, whereas by 8 weeks, more than 98% will be in and out. And during the treatment, we must monitor the patient closely, ensure that the patient is compliant with the LHRH agonist schedule, track the patient's menstrual history, and also measure plasma estradiol and FSH levels, although this is not usually practiced. And of course, we need to take care of bone health. So you can see that overall, this is a much more costly and cumbersome approach compared to the standard of tamoxifen alone. Now coming back to the scenario, after much discussion, you persuaded the patient to receive chemotherapy. The patient completed 4 cycles of AC chemotherapy uneventfully. Then you started her on adjuvant tamoxifen. So now the question is, will you add ovarian function suppression? Now, so should LHRH agonists be added to chemotherapy and tamoxifen? And the problem to this question is that there are too few trials, too few randomized patients. The design of the study is too heterogeneous. There are too many different comparisons, so it's difficult to draw firm conclusions. But probably two of the best publications are the overviews and meta-analysis. So there's the Lancet meta-analysis in 2007 and the Cochrane overview in 2009 that looked at a large number of trials involving more than 12,000 women. And if you look at the Lancet meta-analysis, there was a comparison of LHRH agonists with or without chemotherapy, with or without tamoxifen. But if you examine this carefully, there are actually 2 groups to this. So there is the chemotherapy plus or minus LHRH agonist without tamoxifen. And this is a larger group of close to 2,400 patients. Unfortunately, it is not so clinically relevant unless tamoxifen is contraindicated. More important is the second small group of fewer than 400 patients where we are asking the question, is there a value to add LHRH agonists after we have given chemotherapy and tamoxifen? But this is very small sample size. In the Lancet meta-analysis, the 2 groups were combined together, and it was shown that the addition of LHRH agonists improved both recurrence as well as overall survival, although further analysis suggested that the benefit was seen mainly in younger women, younger than age 40, and not in the older women, more than 40 years old. So based on these data, is there a benefit to using ovarian function suppression? Possibly, but it is not conclusive. Who should it be given to based on the Lancet meta-analysis? Probably to the younger patients. And because we want to derive additional benefit, it will be reasonable to offer this to higher risk patients. When should it be given? Should we give this upfront or only if the patient resumes menstrual function? This is an unanswered question. And what should be the duration? According to most guidelines, 2 to 3 years, but most studies use about 2 years, and the range was from 18 months to 5 years. And what should be the drug and the dose schedule? Most of the studies and most of the guidelines will use Zoladex 3.6 mg every 4 weeks. But the 10.8 milligram 12-weekly schedule would probably be a reasonable alternative that would be more convenient. Now, you treated the patient with 5 years of tamoxifen. The patient is now 46 years old, and she has been anemic for 14 months. What will you do next? Will you stop further therapy, extend tamoxifen to 10 years, switch to an aromatase inhibitor for 5 years, or check plasma FSH and estradiol levels, and then switch to an aromatase inhibitor if menopausal? So you are probably quite familiar with the extended AI study for a patient who is postmenopausal after 5 years of tamoxifen, and there are at least 3 studies evaluating one of the 3 third-generation AIs, MA17, NSABP33, and ABCSG6A. Now, not all the studies that enrolled women who were premenopausal at the time of diagnosis, actually only the first 2 studies, they all showed a benefit. And what might be reassuring, which is relevant to this patient, is the data from the MA17 study, which was published a few years ago, looking at whether premenopausal women benefited as much from this extended AI approach compared to postmenopausal women. And you can see here that premenopausal women derive as much benefit, if not more. In fact, the hazard ratio is very favorable at 0.26. And focusing just on premenopausal women at 4-year, the disease-free survival gain for node-positive patients was 8.8%, and for node-negative patients, 11.5%. So there is a substantial benefit. But of course, when you are going to give an AI to someone who's younger than 50 years old, who actually had therapy-induced amenorrhea, on practical terms, you must be aware that there is such a phenomenon of return of ovarian function while the patient is on an AI. Now, the definition of menopause in a woman who's younger than 50 or 60 is that the patient must be continuously amenorrhea for at least 12 months and should have menopausal levels of estradiol and FSH. And an interesting prospective study out of Spain that was published some years ago looked at 53 ER-positive breast cancer patients who had chemotherapy-induced amenorrhea, and all these patients were at least 24 months amenorrheic. They had menopausal levels of estradiol. The mean age at enrollment was 48, and they were originally on tamoxifen and switched to exemestane, which is something that we do commonly in practice. And because they were enrolled into the study, there was close monitoring of ovarian function in terms of menstrual history, estradiol, FSH levels, ultrasound at 1, 2, and 6 months. And it might surprise you to know that about a third of these patients recovered ovarian function, either the menstruation return or the biochemical recovery. The median recovery time was 5.4 months, and it was much more likely to occur in women who were younger. So the cautionary note here is that if you are going to switch to an AI in younger women, you might want to perform serial monitoring of FSH and estradiol levels during the first 6 months. Make sure that the patient reports menstrual bleed to you, and also ensure that the patient practices adequate contraception. Now, the other alternative for such a patient is to extend the tamoxifen use beyond 5 years, and this would be relevant even if the patient remains premenopausal. And as you know, this is the ATLAS trial. Close to 7,000 women who were randomized after completing 5 years of tamoxifen to 5 more years of tamoxifen or no further therapy. And this is well known by now. At 15 years, there was a recurrence gain of 3.7% and a survival gain of 2.8%. But this is important to note is that the gain was seen late and only after the first 7 to 8 years. So there is a clear but small absolute benefit. The data is particularly pertinent for premenopausal women with no other options, but it should just be highlighted that only a small proportion of women who were enrolled into the ATLAS trial were actually premenopausal at the time of entry. But the fact that extending tamoxifen beyond 5 years could be beneficial is further supported by the UK ATLAS trial, very similar design, close to 7,000 women, and again showing an absolute recurrence gain of about 4% at 15 years. So now we have 2 possible options for this patient. Which method should we choose? Now, the strategies have not been compared head-to-head, but let's see how they measure up. Supporting extending tamoxifen, we have at least 2 studies, the ATLAS trial and the ATLAS trial. Supporting extended adjuvant AI, we have at least 2 studies, but there are many other studies confirming the efficacy of adjuvant AI. In terms of the degree of benefit, extending tamoxifen beyond 5 years confers a 4% reduction in recurrence, but it is late at about 10 to 15 years. But the adjuvant AI, at least based on the MA17 data, we see the benefit early, and it's also the magnitude is also appears to be greater, at least from the MA17 trial. As we are aware of, these two agents have different types of side effects, but there is also a cost difference. AI is being much more costly than tamoxifen, and if you are going to start this in the younger women, we need to ascertain the patient's menopausal status and be aware that an AI may trigger return of ovarian function. So to summarize, for postmenopausal women, there is very little controversy to the use of adjuvant AI, although there are some unanswered questions regarding the optimal schedule and optimal duration. For premenopausal women, the use of ovarian function suppression is controversial, and if you want to consider that, you might want to consider this in only younger patients and higher risk patients. And finally, with regards to the issue of extended adjuvant endocrine therapy, while it is reassuring to know that there is an option for some of the higher risk women, this is not something that you need to offer to everyone. There will be low-risk patients who do not need such extended therapy. And obviously, the decision should be weighed carefully whether the benefit is weighed against the risk of prolonged treatment, also taking into consideration potential problems of adherence, and also we look forward to better biomarkers in the future for better patient selection. Thank you.
So this next section is on targeted therapy in breast cancer.
Slowly.
The next, so this next section is on targeted therapy in breast cancer, mainly targeted therapy against HER2. So we know with the current advent of genomics and increasing drug development, in this arena there are many new biological agents that are being developed. And although this is good for us and good for the patient, but because we know that biological agents are very costly, we sometimes are in a dilemma as to what to recommend for patients, balancing the benefits and the risks. So the key topics we are going to discuss in this talk are chemotherapy with biological agents in the first-line setting, combining biologic agents in a dual blockade fashion, as well as to discuss shortly other newer classes of anti-HER2 agents such as TDM1 and niraparib. I will briefly go through the pattern because I understand there are subsequent speakers who will be discussing this as well. So to start this talk off, we'll go through the HER2 testing and what we consider positive or negative. Firstly, for any breast cancer tumor, we start off by testing the HER2 status by immunohistochemistry. If we find a 0 or 1, these are recommendations from the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And if they recommend that if you have 0 or 1 plus by IHC, this would be considered negative. If you have 3 plus by IHC, this is positive. And if you have 2 plus by IHC, then you need to send the tumor sample off for further testing by shortly known as FISH, which stands for fluorescence in situ hybridization. And this is the FISH testing algorithm. This is the latest by ASCO in 2013. And the main change we find from previous guidelines is the fact that we all know that HER2 FISH 2 or more is positive, regardless of copy number signal. But what is new in these guidelines is the fact that if you have a HER2 FISH ratio of less than 2, but a copy number signal of 6 or more, this would also be considered positive. Now, starting off this talk, we know that HER2 family of receptors comprises 4 transmembrane tyrosine kinase receptors, HER1, 2, 3, and 4. And trastuzumab, which we are going to discuss first, targets the extracellular domain of HER2 and exerts its downstream effects. About 20%, 50 to 20% of breast cancers are HER2 positive. The first study that actually decided unequivocally that trastuzumab had a survival benefit was this landmark study published. So we know that HER2 positive breast cancers are actually have a poor prognosis, and this actually has been studied in this MD Anderson study of HER2 positive patients treated with trastuzumab compared with HER2 positive patients not treated with trastuzumab and HER2 negative patients. And we can see from this survival graph that HER2 positive patients treated with trastuzumab actually has a much better survival outcome compared to HER2 positive patients not treated with trastuzumab, which is in yellow. So we know that trastuzumab has actually revolutionized the prognosis of HER2 positive breast cancers, although it initially started off as being bladder cancer. Now, trastuzumab has been approved by the FDA for metastatic breast cancer in 1998, and it also has become an essential component of the adjuvant treatment in 2006. And since 2007, we have seen the introduction of many new biologic agents against the HER2 family receptors. And this is the slide that I was talking about earlier. This is the landmark study that showed that trastuzumab unequivocally actually shows a survival benefit when it is combined with chemotherapy. So this is the study by Simon et al. And this was published in the New England Journal, and they actually showed that the addition of trastuzumab to chemotherapy, be it anthracyclines or taxanes, actually showed a substantial benefit in disease-free survival as well as median survival. And this is even when 2/3 of those who received previously non-trastuzumab regimens and subsequently went on to trastuzumab. However, we know that cardiac dysfunction with trastuzumab and anthracyclines was 27%, but trastuzumab with paclitaxel had cardiac toxicities of about 13% only. And hence, in our practice, we do not routinely combine trastuzumab with anthracyclines. We only combine it with taxanes and other chemotherapy agents, but not with anthracyclines. In the second study, once again, the results mimic the previous study. This one is, instead of giving paclitaxel, they actually gave docetaxel with trastuzumab and compared it to docetaxel alone, also in the first-line setting. And once again, we see a substantial benefit in overall survival. Now, what happens when a patient actually progresses when they are on a trastuzumab regimen? Do we generally stop the trastuzumab or we continue with it? There are 2 studies that show that actually it is beneficial to continue with HER2 inhibition upon progression of breast cancer. The first study is the German study, which showed that by continuing Herceptin beyond progression in patients that had progressed on previous trastuzumab-containing therapy, there was actually a time to progression, clinical benefit response benefit, as well as overall survival benefit. And in the second study, patients who had progressed on capecitabine as continued HER2 inhibition also showed a benefit in similar parameters. So do we continue Herceptin upon progression? In general, the answer is yes, we do, unless there is severe financial toxicities. Now, which agent do we normally start with? Do we start with Herceptin or do we start with Lapatinib? So in this study, they actually compared first-line paclitaxel or docetaxel with Lapatinib or the similar combination chemotherapy with trastuzumab, and they found that the trastuzumab-containing arm had a better progression-free survival, but there was no overall survival difference. In general, in practice, we normally start with trastuzumab, and it seems to be better also in terms of toxicities. What about the importance of dual blockade of HER2? Now, one of the drugs that have shown a benefit, a synergistic action with trastuzumab, is pertuzumab. And pertuzumab has just come on the market. It actually binds to the extracellular dimerization portion of HER2, and it actually prevents HER2 hormone and heterodimerization and activates antibody-dependent cytotoxicity. The benefit of dual blockade has been shown by the Cleopatra study, where we find that combination of pertuzumab and trastuzumab combined with docetaxel, compared with docetaxel, trastuzumab, and the placebo control, actually showed that there was a significant progression-free survival for the dual blockade arm. And this was even seen in a small number of patients who were exposed to trastuzumab before in the neoadjuvant setting. We also see that there is an overall survival difference as well. And the toxicities, those in red are for pertuzumab, trastuzumab, and docetaxel were more, and those in purple are for those with trastuzumab and docetaxel. So there was more diarrhea, rash, mucosal inflammation, febrile neutropenia, and dry skin with the combined blockade arm. What is interesting is that they found that Asians actually have higher febrile neutropenia rates with docetaxel, trastuzumab, and pertuzumab. And hence, when we use these regimens, normally we would give a white count boost as well. So pertuzumab is actually approved to treat patients with HER2-positive metastatic breast cancer who have not received prior treatment before with an anti-HER2 therapy. And it is approved for administration in combination with trastuzumab and docetaxel. Do we use pertuzumab routinely in our practice? This is a relatively new drug. It is very costly. So I must say that normally in clinical practice, although this is a possible option, but at present do not use it that commonly. Another method of dual blockade is the combination of Lapatinib together with trastuzumab. And this was seen in the study, comparing Lapatinib and trastuzumab to Lapatinib alone as a therapy after progression on previous trastuzumab. And we do find that there is a median progression-free survival benefit, and although the first analysis did not show an overall survival benefit, but subsequently an updated analysis shows that there is a 4.5-month overall survival benefit. So what are the other classes of anti-HER2 agents? I believe the next speaker will be touching on Lapatinib, so I will not go through this section in detail. This is just briefly this is a registration trial for Lapatinib, capecitabine versus capecitabine for patients who have progressed on previous anthracyclines, taxanes, and trastuzumab. And this trial actually found that there was a median time to progression benefit in the dual blockade arm, as well as a median overall survival benefit on comparing the platinum plus capecitabine versus capecitabine alone in the arm which did not contain any crossover. Now, what is useful about platinum is that they found that in the monotherapy group, 11 women had progressive central nervous system metastasis as compared to only 4 in the combination therapy group. And this suggests to us that the platinum might be useful in people with brain metastasis, as it is a small molecule which may be able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier. Now, moving on, the next new targeted agent is TDM1, and our institution was also involved in the TDM1 study, the embryo study. And TDM1 is a new antibody drug conjugate, and this is an attractive feature because it actually has a chemotherapy agent, DM1, which is a microtubule targeted agent, and it is bound by a stable thioether linkage to trastuzumab. And so trastuzumab actually brings this chemotherapy, delivers it in a targeted way to the tumor cell, and then the chemotherapy drug can be internalized and exert its effect without affecting the neighboring cells. This was the registration study. This is the pivotal study of TDM1 versus capecitabine plus the platinum in patients with prior taxanes and trastuzumab and has progressed on them. What they found is that there was a good response rate with TDM1, as well as the duration of response of 12 months compared to the platinum capecitabine arm. And this translated into a good progression-free survival as well of TDM1 over the platinum plus capecitabine of about 10 months versus 6 months. Now, the overall survival benefit continues to be good at 30 months for TDM1 and the platinum capecitabine of 25 months. The side effect profile for TDM1, the main 2 side effects are thrombocytopenia as well as transaminitis. So bleeding is one of the events that were more common in the TDM1 arm compared to the other arm. Now, what about using TDM1 in the more heavily pretreated group? So in the Theresa study, which compared patients who had 2 or more prior HER2-directed therapies, they compared TDM1 versus treatment of physician's choice. And this is a good control arm because it mirrors our real-world practice where we could give any type of regimen. And the median number of prior regimens for metastatic breast cancer was 4. And once again, we find that there is a significant progression-free survival, as well as the interim overall survival shows a benefit as well, although the final results will be out in 2015. In the first-line setting, there are also promising phase 2 data of TDM1, and this is a trial which compared TDM1 versus trastuzumab plus docetaxel in the first-line setting with crossover permitted upon progression. And once again, we saw that there is a good progression-free survival, and although the overall survival is not significant, the results are still immature. So, from these studies, what we need to take home is that the patient population is actually very different. Looking at the first-line setting, 10% of patients in the Cleopatra study had prior Herceptin. 20% of patients in the TDM1 study versus Herceptin plus docetaxel had 20% of them had prior Herceptin, whereas all of them in the first Amelia study and the EGS study had prior Herceptin. Brain mets were completely absent in the Cleopatra study because they were excluded, whereas in the TDM1 study, they were allowed, but they had to be controlled. And in the Amelia study and EGS study as well, they have to be either absent or controlled. So we are dealing with different patient populations in each of these HER2 studies. So this is a rough algorithm of what an ideal setting would be if you had all the money in the world and could afford all the HER2 agents that have just been discussed, which is hardly the case ever in clinical practice. So if you have HER2 and hormone receptor positive metastatic breast cancer, your first line, if you had not been exposed to docetaxel before, or you've been exposed to docetaxel a long time ago, would be pertuzumab, trastuzumab, and docetaxel. If you have been exposed to docetaxel within the past 6 months to 1 year, then perhaps you would consider substituting the docetaxel with other chemotherapy. But I must stress that this is not standard, although it has been discussed before. Now, subsequently, moving on, if you progress in that, you could move on to TDM1, and then finally, capecitabine and the patinib, and trastuzumab and the patinib. Now, this is an algorithm for what the real-world practice would be, because you may not have money for all that, or drugs simply may not be available. So, usually, if a patient progresses on trastuzumab chemotherapy, then for the first line, maybe you would try trastuzumab plus chemotherapy again. So, for example, if a patient progresses on trastuzumab plus taxane, you could switch the patient to trastuzumab and vinorelbine, or trastuzumab and gemcitabine. Subsequently, you could change it to lapatinib, capecitabine, and then a dual blockade of lapatinib and trastuzumab. If the patient has been exposed to trastuzumab recently, you could start with lapatinib and capecitabine, and then move back on to trastuzumab later on progression. There are several ongoing studies that are investigating the non-chemo-containing first-line regimens, such as the Marion study, which is now looking at TDM1 and pertuzumab versus TDM1 versus Herceptin vaccines. And neratinib, our institution is participating in this study. Neratinib is actually a small molecule, irreversible pan-ERB receptor inhibitor, and is being studied in the first line as well as in salvage settings. And there are also new regimens that are being investigated, such as mTOR inhibitors in combination with trastuzumab-containing chemotherapy in the first line setting as well as the third line setting. And we know in the recent ASCO presentation that the Bolero-3 study results are out, and we know that there is a median progression-free survival with everolimus plus trastuzumab plus vinorelbine in comparison to placebo, trastuzumab and vinorelbine in patients who were exposed to prior taxanes and are now trastuzumab resistant. And this benefit is seen in the ER-negative subgroup, although the precise reasons for this are still under investigation. So, in conclusion, we know that metastatic HER2 agents have had a large impact. The need for continued HER2 suppression is actually recommended, and other strategies actually available. They're still undergoing studies, and we also do need further biomarker studies to decide who does or does not need intensive HER2 approaches and who needs other novel strategies. So moving on to adjuvant HER2 therapy, briefly in a couple of slides. Adjuvant HER2 therapy has been studied in these various trials in this graph. I think the take-home message is that overall there is a 40 to 50% improvement in 5-year disease-free survival and 30% improvement in 5-year overall survival when we add trastuzumab to our adjuvant chemotherapy regimens. Now, what kind of regimens do we normally use? I think in our institution we use anthracyclines, for example, AC times 4 or FEC times 3, And then we add on trastuzumab to our taxane regimen. So for taxane regimens, we use weekly paclitaxel for 12 cycles, or we use 4 cycles of docetaxel once every 3 weeks, and we add on the trastuzumab to the taxane portion, and we continue for 1 year. So that's what we normally do. Now, for patients who have cardiotoxicity risk, then we use this regimen, which is СЕКЦИЯ, carboplatin, and herceptin, and we give it known as TCH, and we give it once every 3 weeks for 6 cycles. Now, the duration of adjuvant herceptin has been studied in various settings. 9 versus 12, 9 weeks versus 12 months, 6 versus 12 months, and 12 versus 24 months. But we know that 1 year of adjuvant trastuzumab remains standard practice because the HERA trial did not show that 2 years is better than 1 year, and in fact, giving 2 years of herceptin gives you more cardiac side effects. The FAIR study, which has just come out this year, also does not show that 6 months is actually better than 1 year. The cardiac side effect risks are about 1 to 3% risk of cardiotoxic side effects, and hence when we have patients on trastuzumab, we do the 2D echo at baseline, and then we do the 2D echo once every 3 months during the whole duration of 1 year when the patient is on trastuzumab as per the NCCN /SCO recommendations. Now, what about the role of trastuzumab in small tumors in the adjuvant setting? I think that is a point that often clinicians face a dilemma. If you have a patient that has a tumor of less than 1 centimeter, node negative, HER2 positive, do you then give her adjuvant trastuzumab? Now, this study actually showed that it was studying patients who had not received adjuvant chemo and trastuzumab, and these 98 patients at MD Anderson, they looked at the long-term outcome based on HER2 status, and they found that HER2 positive patients actually did worse than HER2 negative patients, even with very, very small tumors that were less than 1 centimeter. By breast cancer subtype, they also found that HER2 positive patients did worse in general compared to triple negative or hormone receptor positive patients. So this study shows that small tumors, HER2 positive, they still may be a bad player. Although patients with T1 and T1A and T1B tumors, we generally think they have a favorable prognosis, but the decision for adjuvant trastuzumab, if we offer it to them, we have to be careful to explain to them the benefits as well as the side effects before offering them these drugs. The NCCN guidelines actually recommend that the cutoff is 0.6 centimeters and above, then you would offer them trastuzumab. For smaller tumors that are 0.5 or less, if they are node negative, we would not. So the AUTO study is also a study now that is studying the combination of lapatinib and trastuzumab in the adjuvant setting versus sequentially, as well as single agent trastuzumab and lapatinib. And our institution was also involved in this study. And the lapatinib arm has been discontinued in 2011 because it has been found to be inferior. So we do not offer adjuvant lapatinib alone for breast cancer. The affinity study is also ongoing, and it is looking at trastuzumab and pertuzumab in combination in the adjuvant setting with either anthracyclines and taxane chemo or taxane chemo alone. So the take-home points for adjuvant HER2 therapy is that it has a clear and sustained impact on breast cancer recurrence. We use it for patients who are IHC 3+ or FISH ratio 2 or more. The cardiotoxicity is real and has to be monitored carefully, especially patients who have been also exposed to previous anthracyclines. And the optimal duration of therapy is 1 year. Now, the risks and cutoff size is still a point of contention. We need better predictors of benefit for cardiotoxicity, and the future is individualized and rational combination therapy. We know that the patented alone is not enough, as per the auto study just discussed and the TEACH study, which we have not covered today. Enhanced PAC-CR rates when the patented is combined with trastuzumab was seen in the neoadjuvant new auto study, and now the auto study is looking at that. Trastuzumab and pertuzumab combination was seen to derive a good benefit in the Cleopatra study, and is now being tested in the adjuvant affinity study. And is TDM1 good in the adjuvant setting? This we don't know yet. So thank you for your attention.